such a nice introduction. I must say I never thought that I would be one day giving a talk at 1 in the morning from my guest bedroom turned into a home office, but well, 2020 is full of surprises and here we are. So this is the paper processing reserves simultaneously. What I'm looking at in this paper, by the way, do please interrupt me at any point if you have questions. I'm very happy to take them as I go along. What I'm looking at in this paper is a rationing problem, so a situation that we encounter in economics, more specifically in market design, where we have a good that we need to allocate, but we cannot use a price mechanism to do this. So typical example, by far not the only one, is the allocation of seats at a public school. If you have more students who would like to go to school than you have seats available, you cannot just auction off the seats to the highest bidders. That would be quite highly unethical, but you need to use some sort of priority order over your students to determine who's going to go there. Now, the simplest way to do this is to have a single priority ranking of all of the students. And then you can allocate the seats to the students up to the number of seats you have to the highest priority students. Now, the type of solution that I'm studying in this paper is a little bit more flexible than that. It's called a reserve system. And what that allows you to do is to split your capacity, say your seats at the school, across different categories. And each of these categories will have its own priority. So for example, if you have a public school that has 100 seats available, you could have 50 seats allocated based on some priority ranking, the other 50 allocated based on a different priority ranking. One place that does this for the allocation of seats at the public school is the city of Chicago. What they do there is that some of the seats are allocated based on academic merit. It's 30% of the seats that are allocated that way. The other ones are allocated based at least partly on neighborhood. So for some of the seats, students living in specific neighborhoods are given a higher priority regardless of academic merit. Now, the reason they do this in Chicago is to promote diversity, to make sure that students in every public school are coming from different parts of the city, ensuring that you have some diversity in the classroom. And indeed, diversity is one of the reasons why reserve systems might be useful, but we'll go through some examples of other reasons why they can be used in practice. Now, the way reserve systems work, both in practice and actually are designed in the literature, they use something called sequential processing. Now, the way it works is very simple. You're going to take one category at a time and allocate the units of that category based on priority. So suppose your first category has, say, 5 units to allocate. You're going to allocate those 5 units to the 5 highest priority agents. Then you move on to the second category, do the same thing, then the third one, and so on, one category at a time, until you have allocated all of your units, until you've gone through every category. Now, it turns out that the order in which you're going to process your categories is going to matter for the outcome. Right? It can have quite a large impact, but the fact that it has an impact is often something that policymakers don't notice, and there has been unintended consequences because of this, but also the impact that it has can be quite counterintuitive and difficult to anticipate, making the design of reserve systems more difficult as a result. The reason this is happening is that if you have some agents who qualify for multiple categories, so we have a high enough priority for multiple categories, say a student in Chicago who has a very high academic result, but also comes from a neighborhood that is high on some categories list. So could get a seat under either one of those 2 categories. That student will count towards the quota of whichever one of those categories is processed first. And so as a result, a category that is processed later, everything else being equal, is going to matter more. And the reason why this is the case is that if a category is processed late, by the time that category is being processed, some of the agents who have a high priority could get a unit based on that category, might have already received a unit from a category that has been processed earlier, which allows this category to go further down its priority ranking to allocate its units. Now, what I do in this paper is propose a solution to that problem. And the basic idea is to replace sequential processing by simultaneous processing. I will show you how you can actually do this in practice. But the basic idea is that you no longer have a precedence order over the categories. So instead of processing them one at a time in some order, you can process them all at the same time. You no longer have any order over them. So that allows having a more transparent solution in the sense that all that's going to decide what the outcome is what categories you have, how many units each of these categories gets to allocate, and what the priorities are of these categories. But you no longer have that precedence order, that order over the categories that can have some unintended outcomes. Really the basic idea behind my solution is to recognize that an agent doesn't necessarily have to just take a unit from one specific category, but could take parts of that unit from multiple ones. And typically an agent who is going to qualify for multiple categories, so has a high enough priority for multiple categories, instead of taking a unit from one of them, typically whichever one is processed first, that agent is going to count equally towards the quota of all of these categories. Okay, before I go into a little bit more detail, I want to tell you a little bit about why I wanted to work on reserves and why I think that my solution can be helpful. There are really two main reasons. The first one is that reserve systems are actually used in practice. There are applications that use them. The second one is that this precedence order, this order over categories, can lead to some issues, has led to issues, to unintended consequences in the past, and could lead to some problems in future applications as well. And so I think that my solution could really, really help with some real world situations. So I've talked about the allocation of seats at a public school. A very interesting example in that area happened in Boston a few years ago. What they were doing is that they had a two-category reserve system. Half the seats were allocated based just on a general priority, were open to everyone, while the other half were prioritizing students who were living within walking distance of the school. Now, it turns out that this reserve for students living within walking distance, so the way half the seats were allocated, played almost no role in the outcome. They would have had almost the same outcome by just allocating all of the seats based on their general priority order. The reason why this was happening was due to the precedence order and the fact that those seats that prioritize students living within walking distance were processed before the ones that were open, and that almost nullified the impact. This was not something that the authorities intended to happen. They just designed it in that way without realizing that it would actually matter on the outcome. When they realized after that paper by Dürr, Comenius, Patak, and Sonmez was written, when the authorities realized what was happening, they decided to just abandon their reserve system. And perhaps the solution that I proposed could actually have worked for the goal that they had in mind, and I will show you this in a little bit more detail as I go along. A very different allocation is a very different application, is the allocation of H-1B visas. Those of you who have worked in the UK might be familiar with it. This is a work-sponsored visa in the US, sorry, not the UK. And there are 85,000 of those visas being delivered every year. Now, 20 of those are reserved for applicants who have an advanced degree. The other 65,000 are open to everyone. So again, you have a two-category reserve system, one for those visas that are reserved for applicants with an advanced degree, and one for the 65,000 that are open to everyone. So they actually really work it as a reserve system. They use sequential processing, and in 2005, they decided to reverse the precedence order. Before that, they were processing the general category first, After this, they swapped it and processed the advanced degree category first. Now, they did this completely for logistical reasons. They had absolutely no intention for this to impact the outcome. But because the precedence order matters, it did have an outcome, an intended outcome. And what happened is that significantly fewer visas were allocated to applicants with an advanced degree. The number dropped by about a third, so it's quite sizable. Now, the same authors who worked on this H-1B visa program also recently wrote an experimental paper and ran an experiment to better understand how people deal with this precedence order. The main takeaway from that paper is that subjects correctly take into account the impact of all decision-relevant parameters except for the precedence order. And in particular, they find that a large proportion of their subjects completely ignores the precedence order in their decision-making, suggesting that they don't realize that it plays a role at all. And that seems consistent with the evidence from Boston and the H-1B visa program. But another very important point from that paper is that among those subjects who did take into account the precedence order, very, very few did so optimally. And actually what this reveals is that even if policymakers are made aware of the issue, understand that the precedence order matters and are given all the information, it's still very difficult to anticipate what role exactly the precedence order is going to play and how it's going to interact with some other important parameters. So that's making the reserve systems quite difficult to design, and I hope that my solution can actually help with this. Now, one last application that I want to mention before I move on is actually a very exciting one, healthcare rationing. I think Typhoon was one of the first, if not the first speaker to come to this, this seminar series, presenting that paper on healthcare rationing. The idea is to look at the allocation of medical goods. That was a very hot topic a few months ago with the allocation of ventilators in places that unfortunately didn't have enough of them. It is becoming very important again with the allocation of COVID vaccines, if we're lucky enough to have one soon. But more generally, many countries around the world have some rules in terms of how to ration medical supplies should there not be enough of that resource. Now, the way this is usually done is through a single party ranking over the patients, which usually takes medical conditions into account. What they propose in this paper is to use a reserve system instead. And what that allows you to do is to reserve some of the capacity for different groups, for example, people who are, for example, for essential personnel, so people who work in healthcare, for example, or for people from disadvantaged background. Can be many groups, many categories of the population for whom you might want to reserve some of the capacity. It has been received very well by the medical literature, sorry, to the point where it might even be applied, at least partly for the allocation in some countries, for the allocation of COVID vaccines, and maybe it will enter some countries' rules for other applications as well. Now, if we're going to implement reserve systems for the medical sector, just like with other applications, there are reasons to think that the precedence order could present an issue. And so I think my solution could be very useful to that application because policymakers will only have to decide how much capacity they want to reserve for different groups of the population, but they won't have to decide in what order to process everything, knowing that this can have an impact. All right. Are there any questions on the basics before I go into things in slightly more details? Excellent. I'm going to go on and try to give you a little bit more of an idea of what the issue can be with the precedence order and what my solution proposes to do about it. So I'm going to use an example taken from what happened in Boston, and I'm going to frame it in that in that environment. But keep in mind, you could have the exact same example and the exact same results for completely different application. For example, the allocation of COVID vaccines or any other medical resource. So remember what they were doing in Boston is that half of the seats would be reserved. So at each public school, half of the seats would be reserved for students who were living within walking distance of the school. And this was seen at the time as a compromise between a neighborhood school system in which every student just goes to the school closest to them, and a school choice system where you can elect to go to school further from where you live. So I'm going to consider a very simple example. We have one school that has 4 seats available. And so half of them are reserved for students within walking distance, so 2 of the seats. The other 2 are open to everyone. Again, very simple example. We have 6 students who are being considered by that school. I'm going to call them Amy, Bob, Claire, Dan, Eric, and Fiona. Now, 4 of those students live within walking distance of the school. These are Amy, Bob, Eric, and Fiona. The other 2, Claire and Dan, live further away. There is a general priority over the students. In Boston, it was determined by some administrative rules, and ties were broken by a lottery. For the sake of the example, I'm going to assume that the priority is just in alphabetical order. So Amy gets the highest priority, Fiona gets the lowest one. Now remember we have 3 categories. Each of them is going to have its own priority ranking of the students. So for the open category, we're just going to use the general priority, so in alphabetical order. But for the walk category, we're going to give a higher priority to students who live within walking distance of the school. So what that means is that Eric and Fiona, who have the lowest general priority, they are able to get in front of Claire and Dan because they live within walking distance of the school, and Claire and Dan do not. So this is what the example looks like. We have our 2 categories. Each of them has 2 seats to allocate. The students in red are those who live within walking distance. Students are ranked in priority order from top to bottom. So for the walk category, the students living within walking distance get a higher priority. For the open category, the students are simply ranked in alphabetical order. Now let me show you what was going on in Boston. I'm going to show you exactly the system that they were using there to allocate their seats. So they use sequential processing, starting with the walk category. So you first consider the walk category and allocate the 2 seats of that category based on priority, so to the 2 highest priority students. So here these are Amy and Bob. They're going to receive a seat from the walk category. Now you can move on to the open category. So we're done allocating the seats from the walk category. You can move on to the open category, but by the time you do this, Amy and Bob have already been allocated a seat. Therefore, they no longer need to be considered, meaning that the open category will allocate its 2 seats to the next 2 highest priority students, who are Claire and Dan. And so the outcome that you get here is that Amy, Bob, Claire, and Dan get a seat. You can see that these are the 4 students with the highest general priority. And so what this means is that the reserve for walk zone students actually does not play a role at all here. Had we just allocated the 4 seats based on the general priority, we would have gotten the exact same outcome. Now you might think that I cooked up that example on purpose to make sure that this would happen. And you'd be absolutely right, this is exactly what I did. Nevertheless, this is not a crazy example. What the data from Boston suggests is that this is actually very close from what was happening. The reserve there did not play 0 role like it does in this example, but it was playing very little role. And this had to do with the precedence order. And what this example allows you to understand is why this was happening. The key is to find here with Amy and Bob. You can see that Amy and Bob qualify for both categories. They have a high enough priority to get a seat under either one of them. But because the walk category is being processed first, Amy and Bob are going to get a seat from that category. So they're going to count towards the quota of the walk category, which then frees up the 2 seats of the open category to be allocated to the next highest priority students. Now, what happens if you reverse the precedence order? If you process the open category first, you may see where this is going. Now we look at the open category first. So we're going to allocate those 2 seats to the 2 highest priority students, who here are Amy and Bob. So Amy and Bob now get a seat from the open category. We move on to the walk category, but by that time you no longer need to consider Amy and Bob. So you go to the next highest priority student, who are going to be Eric and Fiona. And so the outcome that you get when you reverse the precedence order is that Amy, Bob, Eric, and Fiona get a seat. You can see that these are the 4 students really within walking distance of the school. So in some sense, you get another extreme example where no student from the outside is able to attend the school. And the reason this is happening is that now Amy and Bob count towards the quota of the open category. Now, the key idea behind the solution I'm proposing has to do with those students who qualify for multiple categories. This is the case of Amy and Bob here. The idea is that instead of having them count toward the quota of either one of those 2 categories based on the order in which these categories are processed, they could actually be split across the 2 categories. So here, Amy and Bob qualify for both categories. What my solution will do in this example is that it will allow them to take half a seat from each of the 2 categories. Now, of course, when you talk about a seat at a public school, and actually any unit in any of the applications that I have in mind, we're talking about indivisible units. You can't just give someone half a seat. But this is not what's happening here. Amy and Bob each get 1 seat. They each get to go to the school. It's only for accounting purposes that the seats they get are going to count for half toward the walk category and for half toward the open category. Now, once you have this, Amy and Bob have received a seat. Now, each of the walk and the open category is only allocating 1 seat at this point, and so has 1 more seat that gets allocated to the next highest priority student. That's Eric for the walk category and Claire for the open category. And so the outcome that you get with my simultaneous processing solution here is that Amy, Bob, Eric, and Claire get a seat. That's 3 students who live within walking distance and 1 from the outside. And so both categories matter to the outcome. And remember that what Boston was trying to do here was you have a compromise between neighborhood school and a school choice system. So to favor the students living within walking distance, but still allow some students from the outside to attend the school. And I think the solution I have here actually is in the spirit of what they were trying to do, making me think that maybe had this solution been available, that could have worked reasonably well for what they were trying to do. All right, so hopefully you have some idea what I'm trying to do here. The solution concept I propose is called simultaneous reserve allocation, due to the fact that everything is processed simultaneously. I show in the paper that it always exists and is well defined. In addition, it's computationally easy to calculate. So I have a polynomial time algorithm that can calculate it, so you can implement it without any problem. The key property is a condition that I call category neutrality. The basic idea behind it is that if an agent qualifies for multiple categories, then that agent is going to take the same amount of capacity from each of them. And so that's what was happening with Amy and Bob. They're each qualified for 2 categories. They were taking half a seat from one and half a seat from the other. From a normative perspective, what that means is that all of the categories are treated symmetrically. There's no longer that precedence order. How much a category matters relative to another one depends only on how much capacity you allocate through each of them, but not on where they are in some order of these categories. And from a more technical perspective, I'm going to provide an axiomatic characterization of my solution based on that category neutrality condition and some basic requirement. So that's the basic idea of the paper. In what remains, I'm going to go through things in a little bit more detail, but perhaps this is a good time to stop and ask if anyone has any questions.
Hi, David. Sorry to interrupt you. Can you please go back to the previous slide?
Sorry, can you speak up a tiny bit?
Can you please go back to the previous slide?
Yes, this one?
I'm wondering what would happen is, for instance, if, for instance, say Amy is in, let's say, last priority in one of the groups and the first priority in the other one. For instance, she's the last in open and first in walk. How would you allocate a seat to her in this situation?
Then she would, no matter what, get a seat. No matter the order, she would get a seat from the walk category. Because if you're high up in one category, if you're high up enough in a category, that guarantees you to get a unit, no matter how low you might be in other ones. It's not about taking a weighted average over the different categories. if you're high enough in one of them, you're going to get a unit.
I see, I see. So the half in the second one doesn't matter. So once she gets the trigger to the first one, then the other half from the second one will also be added, no matter what is the priority.
Exactly. So from Amy's point of view, it really doesn't matter whatsoever. She gets a seat no matter what. It's just about how that seat is going to be distributed across the categories.
Sure, sure. Okay, thanks.
No worries.
One more quick one, David. Just a clarification. So imagine that I consider each category to be an indivisible object, and then agents want all objects. Can I then make a connection with a cake-eating algorithm or a probabilistic serial dictatorship in which I just fractionally give people, you know, everyone starts eating from these objects, which are now representing the categories. And would I then arrive to a similar type of logic with the one that you're proposing?
No, it turns out actually, and I can show you an example at the end if you're interested. It turns out the two solutions are actually independent from one another. You don't get the same outcome. I thought for a while that there was a connection, but in spirit there is, but it turns out that the two are independent from one another.
Thank you.
David.
Yep.
Just a question. I think it was related to what was asked before. So rather than having Amy at the top of one priority list at the bottom of the other, let's put her on like the third or fourth place and on the other one. So initially she would use up the full capacity one seat at, say, the walk distance categories, and then you go down. Eventually, once you pass her in the open category, are you then going to reduce her capacity usage from the walk zone and the open zone so that it's 50-50 in each?
Yes, exactly. And this connects to Alex's question in the sense that this is what's going to make it different from probabilistic serial, because then you can reduce how much you're going to get from one category. She still gets 1 unit overall, so it doesn't change what she gets in total, but the allocation among the categories will change.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
David, so follow up on Alex's question. Any connection to fractional deferred acceptance?
Yes. So imagine you're talking about your paper with Utku.
Right.
Yeah. So there is a similarity there. It's not the same in the sense that we're talking here about different order of priorities in different categories and getting parts of this, but they're all identical units. So it's different to your approach, but there is part, and towards the end of the talk, I'll get there. There is part of what I do, which uses actually your approach from that paper.
I see. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. If there's no more question, so what I want to do in the roughly second half of the talk is go through things in a little bit more detail, a little bit more rigorously. Before I do this, I want to go very quickly over the, oops, I need to go back, there you go. Very quickly over the related literature, just to put a little bit the paper in context. And if some of you want to know more about some of the papers, I'm happy to talk about that more. One literature that has to be mentioned because it's really underpinning a lot of what is going on here is the literature on minimum and maximum quotas. In some sense, you can think of this as being the ancestor to the reserve system literature. The way it works there is that you have a single priority ranking over all of the agents, but you might have some additional constraints. For example, you might want that a minimum number of units be allocated to some group of agents, or you might have a maximum number of units that can be allocated to that group of agents. Now, the reserve systems are a little bit more flexible because they allow you to design your categories however you want and have each category have its own priority ranking. So you no longer need to have a baseline ranking of your agents. Therefore, you have a lot of flexibility, a lot of freedom in terms of how you're going to design this. And that gives you, that makes it applicable to a lot of different problems. I've talked about some of the applications. I want to briefly mention some of the papers here. Those 4 papers by Sonmez and Agunturan are looking at university admission in India, which uses a reserve system. Agun and Bo are looking at university admission in Brazil. So I just want to mention here that there are a lot of really interesting application of those reserve systems, and hopefully there will be more that get developed. Now, really the key points that I want to make between my paper and the literature, really the key novelty here is that I'm getting rid of sequential processing and replacing it by simultaneous processing. So really I'm proposing a really new approach to those reserve systems and how to think about them and how to actually make them work. And most of the literature, as I said, uses sequential processing. Now, there are 2 exceptions to solution concepts that don't use sequential processing, or only partly so. One is the smart reserve system of Pataxon-Mez and Vernier-Mez, and one is the egalitarian allocation of Özgür-Yilmaz. I'm not going to go into the details here in the interest of time. If you're interested in talking more about those solution concepts, I'm happy to do so. The point I want to make is that the goals here are completely different. Smart reserves do a matching between agents and categories. The egalitarian allocation is trying to give each agent something as close as possible as what the other agents are doing. So none of this is trying to treat the categories symmetrically as I'm doing in the paper. Very last literature I want to mention, and that goes back to what Alex was asking just before, is the random and probabilistic serial literature. And indeed, from a methodological point of view, there is a similarity. Those of you who are interested in that literature might see some similarities as I go through my algorithm. Again, I have an example to show that the 2 are actually independent from one another. As was alluded to through Simon's question, the big difference is that you can have a certain amount of capacity from one category, and that can get reduced as things go along. Again, happy to talk about this in more detail, but for now, I'll just leave it at this. So let me try to be a little bit more formal about things, starting by introducing the setup. It's a fairly simple setup. We're going to have a set of agents, depending on the application at hand. That could be, they could be students, patients, visa applicants. And we have a certain number of units to allocate. These are all identical and indivisible. So depending on the applications, they could be school seats, they could be ventilators, they could be H-1B visas, they could be something else. Now, what makes a reserve system is that you have a set of categories. So in the example I showed you, we had 2 categories, work zone and open. If you're talking about the allocation of a medical resource, you might have a category for essential personnel that would give a higher priority to those patients who are among those occupations. In the H-1B visa program, you have 2 categories, advanced degree and open, but it's not limited in any way. You could have as many categories as you like. The model is completely flexible in that way. So you could fit a lot of different applications in that model. Now, every category is going to have its own priority order over the agents. Again, you have full flexibility here. They could be very similar to one another, very different. You can do it however you like to fit whatever policy goals you have. One point that I want to make here is that in some applications, not every agent is going to be eligible for every category. An example where that happens is the allocation of H-1B visa. Remember, some of the visas, 20,000 of them, are reserved for applicants who have an advanced degree. And this is what we call a hard reserve, in the sense that even if there are some of these visas that remain, applicants who don't have an advanced degree cannot get one of them. So that means that these applicants who don't have an advanced degree are not eligible for that category. So the way I fit this into the model is that I have an eligibility threshold that is part of the ranking. If an agent is ranked above it, that agent is eligible for that category. If the agent is ranked below it, the agent is not eligible. In the other applications I've mentioned, the allocation of school seats or medical resource, typically every agent is going to be eligible for every category, and this is not going to play a role. But that, again, this is application dependent. Finally, each category is going to have a quota. This is the amount of capacity that you're allocating through that category's priority order. Now, the sum of the quotas will have to be equal to the number of units that you're allocating. So all of the capacity you have has to be allocated through one of the categories. One small technical point that I want to mention here is that the number of units is always going to be an integer because we're talking about indivisible units. But the quota of an individual category does not have to be. It can very well be an integer, there's no problem with that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be any positive real number. And in many applications, you might not need that. It could be quite useful if you have a low number of units to allocate. For example, if you have a hospital that has 5 ventilators and half of them have to be reserved, say, for essential personnel, you can actually put the quota to 2.5. It doesn't have to be rounded to either 2 or 3. Okay, so that's the basic setup. Now, an allocation, which is really the solution that you want to have, is going to simply be a matrix. In the rows, you're going to have the agents. In the columns, you're going to have the categories. And each element in your matrix is going to tell you how much capacity the category is allocating to that agent. And so it has to be the case that no category is allocating overall more than its quota, and no agent is allocated more than 1 unit in total. So this is what an allocation can look like in its matrix form. This is the one from the example I showed you before. So what this matrix tells you is that Amy is allocated half a seat from the work category and half from the open category. And so on, every element here tells you how much capacity the category is allocating to the agent. Now, every allocation is going to generate an aggregate allocation. This simply tells you how much each agent is allocated in aggregate. So you obtain it by summing up over all of the columns. So here, Amy is getting half a seat from each of the 2 categories. In aggregate, she's getting 1 seat. Claire has a different allocation, 0 and 1, but in aggregate, she has the same aggregate allocation. She's still allocated 1 unit. Okay, so these are the basics definitions. Before I go into the axioms and start becoming a little bit more technical, are there any questions on this? A secret reason for asking that is so that I could drink a little bit of water, so I'm trying to do 2 things at once. All right, so I've talked about allocations. Now I want to talk about the properties that I would like my allocations to have. The first 3 are very common and uncontroversial. They've been introduced before, to the best of my knowledge, in every paper that has a reserved system or every application of reserved systems. These are going to be satisfied. The one axiom that is new and really sets my solution apart is that category neutrality condition that I mentioned. And so I'm going to introduce that in a little bit more detail. So let's go through these 4 axioms. The first one is very simple. It's called compliance with eligibility requirement. All that it's telling you is that an agent can only get capacity from a category if she is eligible for that category. So typically an H-1B visa applicant who does not have an advanced degree is not able to get a visa or any part of a visa from the advanced degree category. So this is violated in this example here. You can see that A2 is getting capacity from C2, even though she has a lower priority, or she's ranked lower than the eligibility threshold, meaning that A2 is not eligible for C2. So you can just fix this by removing that capacity from A2, and you obtain an allocation that satisfies the axiom. Again, in many applications, all agents will be eligible for all categories. So this axiom here is going to just be satisfied trivially. Second axiom is also relatively straightforward, non-wastefulness. The idea is, as you might guess, that you want to eliminate waste. So you want to eliminate a situation where an agent is allocated less than 1 unit in aggregate. So we'd like to have more capacity and is eligible for a category that has some space left. So this is typically happening here. A2 is allocated 1/2 in aggregate. And there is here half a unit at C2 that remains. So that half unit is wasted. It could benefit A2, but it's not being allocated. So this generates waste. The way to fix this is, well, to just allocate that capacity to A2, and then you're going to satisfy the axiom. Third basic axiom is the respect of priorities. You might already have an idea where this is going. Importantly, we're talking about respecting the priority at every category, respecting all the priorities of all of the categories. So when might a priority be violated? Well, it's going to be violated if you're an agent, you're allocated in aggregate less than 1 unit, so you would like more. And for some category, there is someone who has a lower priority than you who gets allocated capacity from that category. In that case, your priority is violated by that agent who has a lower priority than you. So this is exactly what is happening here. Agent A1 here is allocated half a unit in aggregate. So we'd like some more capacity, but there's here a lower priority agent who is allocated some capacity at C2. So here the capacity of the priority, of A1 at C2 is being violated. You can fix this by removing that capacity away from A2. You obtain that allocation here, which satisfies the axiom. It respects priority. You can see that it's wasteful here. So it respects axiom 3, but not axiom 2, because there's 1 unit of C2 that is not being allocated. Okay, so typically you're going to want your allocations to satisfy those 3 axioms. There are basic requirements, and we're going to be looking at allocations that satisfy all 3. Again, this is very common in the whole literature as well as in practice. Now, the axiom that is new to this paper and really underpins my solution concept is that category neutrality condition. The idea is the following. Let me try to put it in words, and then I'll show you what is going on in the counterexample here. The idea is that suppose that you're an agent and there is and you're getting less capacity from a category than from another one. So you're not getting the same amount of capacity from the 2 categories. Then it must be that the category who is allocating you less capacity is allocating everything to either you or people with a higher priority than you. In other words, that category that is allocating you less capacity must not have the ability to allocate you more without violating the priorities. So this is being violated here. You can see that A1 is getting 1 unit from C1 and 0 from C2. So A1 is allocated less capacity from C2 than from C1. So in order to satisfy the category neutrality condition here, you'd need C2 to be allocating all of its capacity to A1, or in general to higher priority agents, but there are none in this specific example. You can see that this is violated here because there is 1 unit of capacity that C2 has, and that is not being allocated to A1. So here we're violating category neutrality. The way to fix it here is to split evenly the units that A1 is being allocated between the 2 categories. Okay, so this is the important axiom that I'm introducing in this paper. Okay, so I have my axioms. Harris, did you have a hand raised? Was that?
Yes, I had a question regarding your axiom on the previous slide. I was wondering if it's compatible with utilizing all the reserve seats or maximizing the number of utilized reserve seats?
Not necessarily. There can be examples where it's not going to do this. So this is, I'm guessing you're referencing the smart reserves solution. And so it's not necessarily going to be the case. One extension that I would like to work on at some point is trying to see how it can be combined. And typically, if you have a category that is already allocating all of its capacity, could we relax a little bit category neutrality so that that category can allocate more to the agents so that all of it is being allocated? So I think there could be an extension there, but at the moment it's not the case.
Okay, thanks.
So what is the normative appeal of Axiom 4, if any? Why should we care about that?
So really the normative idea here is that it ensures that you're treating all of the categories symmetrically. Instead, when you have an agent that qualifies for multiple categories, instead of having that agent take one unit from either one of them, you're going to ensure that the agent takes the same amount of capacity from each of them. And so that ensures that you're treating all categories the same, and that the relative importance of categories depends only on how much capacity they get to allocate, but not on some order among them or how much they're going to contribute to units received by agents who qualify for multiple categories.
Okay, so maybe that was, okay, so then the idea would be, oh, we have these categories because we care equally about these things and you want to respect that. And maybe that was Harry's question, or you answered it before and I didn't pay attention, but there would be the generalization to a weighted average, right? So you could have weight alpha on one and 1 minus alpha on the other one and then maintain that.
Completely, and this is an extension I have not done that I'm thinking could be interesting to do, and that would, in some sense, if you're doing this, you could convexify the space of mechanisms. If you look at sequential allocation, that's going to get you to a corner of that space. Mine is, in some sense, right in the middle of it, but you could have that whole, you could open up that whole space of solutions.
Cool, thanks.
Harris, you still have your hand raised. Was that on purpose?
Yeah, I had a follow-up question regarding this axiom. It seems as if it's geared towards category uniformity rather than neutrality. There might be some much weaker axioms which are capturing neutrality and they're compatible with basic efficiency axioms.
Mm-hmm. So you think uniformity would be a better term for it?
It's not just about terminology. You mentioned that you're going for treating categories in a similar way, mm-hmm. But you're forcing it in a very strong way, and that's making it incompatible with utilization of reserves, for instance. So one could use some combination of the smart reserve approach of Sonmez and Yenmez and still go for sequential processes. I think that might lead to efficient outcomes as well.
Depending on the precedence order, you might get to something that is going to be efficient. Yes, with sequential. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can talk more. I don't want to go into too much technical details on this. If you'd like, we can talk more about how you could actually combine the two. I have some ideas about that, but I have not developed it formally yet.
All right, thanks.
Brilliant. I'm going to go on, but please do interrupt at any point if you have more questions. So I have my 4 axioms. What I want to try to do now is to find a way to find an allocation that satisfies all 4 of them. And the way I'm going to do this is through an algorithm. And let me walk you at the high level how the algorithm is working, then I'll show you an example and hopefully you'll have an idea of how things are going. So the way the algorithm starts is that at the beginning, every agent is going to demand 1 unit. We're looking at agents who need 1 unit of the good. In the first round, the categories are going to allocate the quota, so the capacity that they have, to the agents in order of priority. So typically, a category that has 5 units in its quota is going to allocate those 5 units to the 5 agents who have the highest priority. Now, the important part here is that this allocation is not happening sequentially, it's happening simultaneously. Each category independently, without worrying about what the other ones are doing, is allocating its capacity. Now, this simultaneity might then lead to a situation where an agent is allocated more than 1 unit in aggregate. Typically, you could have an agent who gets a unit from one category and a unit from another one, and so in aggregate is allocated 2 units. So this is where the demand adjustment starts playing a role. Whenever an agent is allocated more than 1 unit in aggregate, that agent's demand is going to start going down up to the point where the agent is allocated 1 unit in aggregate. This demand, you can think of this as being an upper bound on how much a category can allocate to the agent. So by bringing it down, you bring down how much the agent is allocated in aggregate up to the point where he's only allocated exactly 1 unit. Now, because some demands go down, you can go back to the capacity allocation, and some of the categories, because demands have gone down, have to allocate less to some of their top priority agents, and therefore able to go further down their priority ranking to allocate some capacity. That might lead to some agents getting, some new agents getting more than 1 unit overall. Their demand is going to go down, and so on and so forth. This is going to keep going round by round, up to the point where none of the agents is allocated more than 1 unit in aggregate. And at that point, we have found an allocation. So let me show you a very simple example on, to illustrate how that might work. So we have 3 categories here. Each of them has a quota of 1, so each of them has 1 unit to allocate. And we have 4 agents which are ranked here from top to bottom in order of priority. So in the first round, each category is going to allocate its capacity, so here the 1 unit that it has, to its highest priority agent. Now it turns out that A1 has the highest priority for all of the categories. So A1 is going to be allocated 1 unit of capacity from each of the 3 categories. Again, here the allocation is happening simultaneously. Each of the categories allocate its capacity without worrying about what the other ones are doing. So what that means is that agent A1 now is allocated 3 units in aggregate, but needs only 1. So it's allocated, too much is being allocated to A1. There are 2 more units that we could allocate elsewhere. So again, the idea here is not that A1 is going to take up 1 unit from one of the categories, but instead is going to take the same amount of capacity from each of them. And the way we do this is by bringing A1's demand down from what it was originally, which was 1, to just 1/3. So A1's demand is going to fall to 1/3. Why is it 1/3? Because this demand is going to be an upper bound on how much each category can allocate to A1. Once each category allocates only 1/3 to A1, A1 is allocated 1 unit in aggregate. Okay, so in the result of the first round is that A1's demand has fallen from 1 to 1/3. Now in the second round, because A1's demand has fallen, now each of the categories only need to allocate 1/3 to A1, and therefore is able to allocate 2/3 to the next priority agent. So C1 and C2 will be able to allocate 2/3 to A2, and C3 will be able to allocate 2/3 to A3. Now we have A2 who's in that situation where an agent is allocated more than 1 unit in aggregate. A2 is allocated 2/3 at C1 and 2/3 at C2. So that's 4/3 in aggregate, only need 1 unit. So A2's demand is going to fall, and this time it's going to fall to 1/2. Why 1/2? Because there are only 2 categories allocating capacity to A2. So the demand is going to fall to 1/2, the exact point where A2 in aggregate is allocated 1 unit. Okay, so in round 2, we have now A2's demand that has fallen to 1/2, meaning that categories C1 and C2, they now only need to allocate 1/3 to A1 and 1/2 to A2, meaning that they each have 1/6 remaining that they can allocate to the third party agent. So C1 allocates 1/6 to A3, and C2 allocates 1/6 to A4. At this point, you can check that no agent is allocated more than 1 unit in aggregate. So we are done and we have found an allocation. This is what the allocation looks like. Remember, this is just a matrix representation of the allocation. Tells you how much each category is allocated to each agent. And this is the corresponding aggregate allocation that you can see. Okay, so in the example that I just showed you, the algorithm found an allocation after just 3 rounds. So reasonably quickly, a computer can do that in a matter of seconds, if not less than that. So it's a very well-behaved example. Now, it turns out that things are not always that easy. The algorithm may actually never reach an allocation. The basic idea of what is going on is that in every round, you have some agents who are allocated more than 1 unit, that extra capacity gets to be reallocated in the next round. Now, how much gets reallocated in each round is going to go down over the rounds, but we may never actually reach zero. We may be getting close to zero, but we may never actually reach zero, in which case we never reach a situation where no one is allocated more than 1 unit. So we may never reach an allocation, but we're going to get arbitrarily close to 1. And again, the idea is that the amount of capacity that has to be reallocated in every round is going down. It's going to converge to 0, but it may never reach it. And I can give you an example where this is going, where this is happening. I'm not going to go through it now in the interest of time, but if you're interested after the talk, we can go through one. What that means is that the algorithm may never actually reach an allocation, but it's going to always converge to 1. And it's always going to converge to a unique allocation. So that means that the solution concept is actually well-defined. The outcome of the algorithm is well-defined. It's going to be the allocation towards which the algorithm is converging. It might be that it reaches it. It might reach it for a few rounds. It might reach it after many, many rounds, or it might never actually reach it, but in any case, it's converging to it. So the solution concept is well-defined. Now, it's nice to have a solution concept that's well-defined, but if you can't actually calculate it because you have an algorithm that never ends, that can be a little bit of a problem in terms of implementation. So what can we do about this? Well, the first point to make is that when you only have 2 categories, which as you have seen from examples is something that can actually happen, then we don't have a problem. The algorithm has there's an upper bound on the number of rounds that the algorithm will run for, and that ensures that the algorithm works in polynomial time. So the issue only occurs when you have 2 or more categories. In that case, as I mentioned, the algorithm may never reach an allocation. And the solution here is to use linear programming whenever the algorithm is slowing down. So whenever the algorithm is no longer making enough progress, is starting to not reallocate enough capacity, you can solve a linear program that takes you where the algorithm is going, but it takes you there in one go instead of possibly infinitely many rounds. And the idea, Onur was talking about that just before, the idea is similar to that of Onur and Utku, who do this for a deferred acceptance algorithm in a school choice context that assigns fractions to students. And there as well, the algorithm may never actually end. What they do is whenever the algorithm is converging but getting slower, they solve a linear system of equations. What I do here is really the same idea. It's slightly more general. In some cases, the linear system of equations will not actually work, and you're going to need to use linear programming. But the idea is similar. I'm not going to go into all the details of it because it's the more technical part of the paper. But the point that I want to make is that you can modify the algorithm that I presented by just adding linear programming in some places to make it faster. It's going to give you an algorithm that is outcome equivalent, but it's going to find it in a limited number of rounds and actually in polynomial time. So that solves the problem of computing it. You can just add linear programming to the algorithm. So there's actually no problem in computing the outcome. Okay, so I have a solution concept. It's well defined. You can find it in polynomial time. Now, how does it fare with respect to the axioms, to the properties that I mentioned earlier? Well, as you may have guessed, it's going to satisfy all 4 of them. And this is fairly intuitive from the way the algorithm is defined. It ensures that in every round you satisfy all of them. The only problem has to do with those agents who are allocated more than 1 unit. And so once you have solved this, you have found an allocation satisfying all 4 axioms. The next natural question is whether that is actually the only allocation that satisfies those 4 axioms, or whether you have multiple ones, in which case you might wonder which one to choose. Now, the answer here requires a little bit of nuance. The short answer is that no, it's not the only one. So there may be multiple allocations that satisfy the 4 axioms. In fact, there can be potentially infinitely many of them. So that might look like a little bit of a problem, but a very important thing to note is that while there might be multiple, in fact, infinitely many allocations that satisfy all four axioms, all of them are going to generate the same aggregate allocation. And so from a practical point of view, this is extremely important because the differences among these allocations is then immaterial. The difference simply amounts to an accounting problem. You get a bit more from one capacity or a bit more from the other. But in terms of the aggregate capacity, so how much you get in aggregate as an agent, they're all going to be identical. So what that means is that you may have multiple ones, but which one you choose, whether you choose the one that the algorithm produces or another one, in the end, it's going to lead to the same result. Okay, one very last point that I want to make before I conclude. You may have noticed in the example that I showed you that some of the agents were allocated an amount of capacity in aggregate between 0 and 1. You had, in the example I showed you, A3 was allocated 5/6 and A4 was allocated 1/6. Now, this might be a problem in practice because in all the applications that I've talked about, we're talking about indivisible units. We're talking about school seats, we're talking about ventilators, vaccine doses. You can't split those things. So what can we do? What can we do about this? Well, there are 2 points that I want to make. The first one is that the number of agents in that situation is actually going to be quite small. There is an upper bound on the number of agents in that situation, which is equal to the number of categories that we have. Okay, so at most, C agents are allocated capacity strictly between 0 and 1 in aggregate. Now, typically, in all of these applications I've mentioned, the number of agents tend to be much, much larger than the number of categories. If you're talking about the allocation of school seats, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of students. And in Boston, you had 2 categories. In Chicago, you had 5. So there's a big discrepancy between the two. And so what that means is that the proportion of students or agents in that situation is always going to be, is generally going to be very small. The vast majority of the agents are going to be allocated either 0 or 1, so we don't have a problem for them. Nevertheless, for those agents who are allocated something between 0 and 1, we need to figure out who's going to get a unit and who's not. There are, I think, at least two possible solutions for this. One, which is, I think, quite natural for economists, is to treat each agent's aggregate allocation as a probability. And the Birkhoff-von Neumann theorem, for those of you who are into that literature, guarantees that you can always design a lottery such that these are going to be the probabilities. So in the simple examples I had before, we have one more unit that needs to be allocated. In that case, it would be allocated to A3 with probability 5/6 and A4 with probability 1/6. You could just roll the dice. An alternative way to do this could be to allocate one unit to the agents who have the largest aggregate allocation. So you rank the agents from largest to smallest aggregate allocation, and you allocate the remaining units to those who are at the top of this. So in the example here, A3 would be allocated the last unit because his aggregate allocation is larger than A4's. I'm not taking a stance as to which one of those two options to use. This is application dependent. Maybe there are some other ways you might want to do this. The 2 points that I want to make is that one, it's not going to matter that much. It's only going to affect a very small proportion of agents. The other point I want to make is that there are reasonable ways to do this. We're quite used to dealing with this as economists. Okay, so I think I'm a little bit ahead of time, which will leave some time for questions, but I'll very quickly conclude. The solution concept I'm proposing is called the simultaneous reserve allocation. You can find it with an algorithm called simultaneous reserves as well. And really the key idea from an algorithmic point of view is that it's going to process all of the categories simultaneously instead of sequentially. By using linear programming, can ensure that it works in polynomial time. From a practical point of view, it means that the allocation is going to be independent of any precedence order. So the outcome is going to only depend on what the priorities and quotas are going to be, making the reserve system easier to design. The key property that it has, that category neutrality condition that I mentioned. And what this says is that if an agent qualifies for multiple categories, then she's going to take the same amount of capacity from each of them. I think that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take some questions now.
So, excellent talk, David. Just as we all expected. Thank you so much. I'll stop the recording now, and please, everyone, go ahead and ask your questions. Just unmute yourself.